Namaste. Welcome to the Hindu Parenting Podcast. Though most Hindus live in India, the Caribbean countries have a sizable number of Hindus who have maintained their faith and traditions despite being away from India for many generations. There is much we can learn from them about what it takes to stay Hindu generation after generation. How did they do it? Let's listen to Shawn Binda, who is of Indo-Caribbean ancestry and has grown up in Canada. Shawn hosts a YouTube channel called Hindu Lifestyle to reach out to Hindu youth growing up in North America. Shawn has a passion for Hinduism. He takes a keen interest in teaching today's youth, teenagers, and young adults about Hinduism. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn. We are so happy to have you here. I'm sure all the parents listening will be waiting to see how your ancestors maintained their Hindu connection and what makes you so passionate about your heritage.
Namaste. Thank you for having me. I've been listening to the podcast for, I would say, the last 2 to 3 years, more so when COVID started back in 2020. That's when my son had just turned 2. And being a Hindu parent growing up here, I was looking for resources or to reach out to other parents. And that's when I stumbled upon the work that was being done. And I'm very happy for you guys for asking me to come on the podcast. There's a lot of things we can go into about why I'm so passionate about my heritage. And there's a lot of questions that I'm sure that the audience might have, because one of the first things that I always get asked is, well, one of the first things that greets me when I talk to other Hindus from around the world is that, number one, they're not even aware of Hinduism being present in the Caribbean, and that's probably one of the first questions that I do get. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you, and let's get to it.
Great, thank you. To set the context here, living outside India and staying Hindu must be quite a challenge with each successive generation. So, are you a fourth generation Hindu?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it really depends on how you want to answer it. So I'll probably just go into a little bit of my history. I'm technically a second generation Canadian. So what that means is that my parents, whom they migrated from the island of Trinidad and Tobago in the 1970s. So my dad came up in 1972, and that was during a large wave of immigration where the prime minister of the time, who is Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he had opened the doors, and a lot of immigrants had arrived in Toronto. So my dad came up in 1972. So they were technically first generation Canadians. But the Hindu ancestry part is a little bit different, in the sense that my parents were born in Trinidad and my grandparents were also born there. From what my father told me, my great great grandfather was from India, and unfortunately, I don't have much information on him. So that would be my father's great grandfather. I have the stories from what my father told me, is that our ancestors came from UP in India. We came from a family of cowherders. So my father and even my mom, they primarily worked the land. So they looked after cows, they planted rice, they planted crops. So that is sort of the history of the family ancestry. So I guess if you were to kind of classify it, because I was thinking about it, and it's possibly fourth generation Hindu, if you would, maybe fifth, depending on how you want to look at it. I think the more interesting part is the successive waves of migration. So my ancestors, if you want to say, left, and we could probably get into that later. You know, when they left and they went into the Caribbean, and that's where my parents were born, and then they subsequently left there and came to Canada, and that's where I was born. So through these successive waves of migration, this Hindu identity persisted.
So, in your opinion, now that you've traced your ancestry and your journey personally. What do you think are the reasons that Hinduism has survived in the Caribbean? And what made you perhaps stay within the Hindu fold? Now you said you're either fourth or fifth generation, depending on how we look at it. So, what made you stay within the Hindu fold, and what allowed Hinduism to survive in the Caribbean?
So I had done a video on this very question a few months ago because it's something that once I got more active on social media is a question that kept on coming up over and over again is, how did Hinduism survive in the Caribbean? And I don't know if I can give you one answer. It's a multifaceted answer because there are so many different things that happen from the perspective of society, from the struggles of the land. But if I had to venture in, I'll just start. So the number one thing is struggles in a new land, meaning that what doesn't hurt you makes you stronger. So you can imagine that when a group leaves and they settle, there are so many different emotional things that are going on. Is that you have been taken from your ancestral homeland and you're put into a new place. You have never been in this area, and now you're being forced to work in a sense on the agricultural land. So I would say that those struggles probably cemented the Hindu identity because there was a sense of who you were and there was the sense of who you were not, meaning that you were not the colonizers. And in the Caribbean islands, we also had the Africans that were there who had come prior as slaves. So I'd say the struggles in the new land is probably one reason. The second thing I would say is this concept of like sadhana and daily puja. It's something that I grew up with, like here in Canada, watching my father. Every day he would wake up, and no matter what we were doing, either the night before, whether we'd come home at 2 o'clock in the morning due to a function, he would still wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would do his puja. He would offer his water to Surya Bhagwan. He would go down to our puja room that we had in our house, and he would sit there for 45 minutes to an hour doing his daily puja. And when I used to ask him about this as I got older, because as a young kid you usually don't ask your parents why they're doing this, but as I got older and we would have these conversations, I would ask like, why do you do this? And I used to just hear him say all the time is that this is what you do. Like, this is who we are, and this is how you form that connection to the divine. And part of that is also this concept of bhakti. And your audience is probably well aware of it, but from the Hindus that grew up in the Caribbean, bhakti is this devotional love. And love, I'm not talking about a physical love, but this longing to connect to a higher spirit, to a higher energy, to that higher divine being. And it's something that was reflected in the daily life of everyone growing up there. And that transcended like how the community was. So that meant that you did your daily puja in the morning. It meant for every Hindu festival you participated, you fasted, you prepared prasad, whether that be cooking or getting fruits. It means at least once a year you probably did a puja in your home. It translated into music, meaning singing and bhajans and kirtan and that community. So that those were some of the basics. The other reason, which I think was interesting, as I was doing a little bit more research on this as I got older, is that this caste, it was something that I actually never thought about, but in reading the writings of the colonizers, like the reverends and the priests and everyone who had formed schools and churches in the Caribbean, they kept on referring to how caste was something that the Hindus in the Caribbean, it was kind of hard for them to leave. So that sense of identity of who they were was a big part of that. And I think that is what cemented this identity that we call Hinduism. And then if you sort of take that into Canada, like some of those things did change, but the basis of some type of daily sadhana or puja, the concept of bhakti, those are all of, those main points of how the Hinduism survived in the Caribbean.
Let's focus on the Caribbean part just a little bit more, because most people are quite unaware that Hinduism even exists in a place that very few of us know something about. So how did Hinduism get there? I mean, I know it's with, like you said, when people from India moved there, but usually you see a lot of dilution happening. Was there no pressure to convert? Because when Hindus are in a minority, especially, I can imagine that there's a lot of pressure on people to just convert out of Hinduism. So how did your ancestors handle that, if you can, if you know anything about that? And did you face any such pressure, or did you hear your parents talk about any such thing in the Caribbean?
So let me address the first part of that. When I say that our ancestors left, let's go into a little bit of the history in case many are not aware. So many know that slavery existed throughout the British colonies. So when Britain went and they quote unquote colonized the world, they were in India, but slavery ended in the 1800s, and it was something that was put to a stop. So they then had to look around and say, okay, well, we don't have slaves for cheap labor. Where do we look to? And at that time, the Brits were in India, and they realized that the population, the laborers in India would be a good source of that labor. So they created something called indentureship, and indentureship was a contract that Indians would have to sign, and if they didn't know how to write, they used their fingerprint, and they signed a contract to go work in the Caribbean. And it just wasn't in the Caribbean. This, of course, happened in South Africa, in East Africa, in Mauritius, in Fiji. So they signed a contract to either work for 5 years or 10 years. And when they were brought there after that contract was up, a lot of them stayed back because they were given the option that after your contract was done, the British would either send you back to India, but at the time, what happened is that they didn't want to have to pay that cost of having to ship people back on boats.
Mm.
Now, the interesting part of this history is that growing up, we never really spoke much about, how was it that they left? And it was a phrase that I heard people just saying is that, our ancestors left. But truthfully speaking, a lot of them were tricked into leaving. They were coerced, some were kidnapped. And it was a brutal time of history that we actually don't know how the living conditions were. We have stories passed on from grandmothers and grandfathers, but I think if we were to sort of take a step back and look at it, it was most likely akin to slavery in terms of the working conditions, because you can imagine that slavery ends in all of these islands, and the laborers that come from India are basically replacing these African slaves that were there. Now, yes, they were considered laborers, but truth be told is that it was still the same conditions that were there. So when we talk about Hinduism now, is that so we have these group of laborers that are there, and they want to maintain this identity. So the first thing is that, now you're not in India, you're in a different country. So number one, you don't have your temples, your pundits. A few of them did come over, so they started to congregate. And then, the third part of that is that what ends up happening now is you start following what the society is doing there. So that meant that once a week is when you would have time for yourself. So that typically was on a Sunday. And if your audience is aware, like in the Western world, Christians go to church on a Sunday. And that is basically what happened for the Hindus in the Caribbean, is that they started to congregate and have satsangs on a Sunday. And as time went on and indentureship ended, there were many who did not go back. I would say the majority stayed back, and that's when they started to purchase land. So after their contract was up, the British gave them land, and then they started farming and they started forming their own communities. But addressing your second point, the issue of conversions was a big issue. And that's one of the reasons why, like, my name is Shawn. In the Caribbean, the pressure to convert was 100% there, because it was the colonizers, it was the Christian missionaries that established schools, and you were asked to be baptized, or you would have to become a Christian, whether it be a Presbyterian or a Christian or anything like that. You were sort of forced to convert in order to attend these schools. And I have people within my own extended family that went through this. Is that, they realized that in order to get a job or to go to school, is that they had to change their name, and then they had to convert. But that being said, is that there was a push afterwards to start fighting back against this. And that's where we have the formation of the Mahasabha in Trinidad. And this was a group of Hindus that got together and realized that they need to have more of a political voice. And they pushed and they fought and they started to form political parties and win elections. And this group actually established a Hindu school board. And this happened in the 50s and the 60s, so the 1950s and the 1960s. So present day right now is that Trinidad is one of the few islands in the Caribbean, if not the only one, that has Hindu school boards. So there's Hindu schools that is open to anyone, actually. So you don't have to be an Indian, you don't have to be a Hindu to attend, but it's understood that when you do attend these schools, you will be learning Hindu prayers, you will be participating in all the pujas and the festivals that they do. And if you actually go into the stats, these schools are recognized as some of the top academic schools in Trinidad. So that is sort of the history of what happened. And there are a lot of influential figures that actually cemented this Hindu identity in the island of Trinidad.
So this brings me to an interesting question. What is the percentage of Hindus in the Caribbean, and what political say do they have in the affairs of the Caribbean? Now, the
So
Caribbean is actually an amalgamation of a few islands, right? I'm
yes,
talking about the
so
Caribbean as a whole. Yeah.
yes, so the political voice of Hindus in the Caribbean is interesting, because it does vary by country. So when we talk about the Caribbean, we should probably go into a little bit of what we mean by the Caribbean. So for those that are not aware, the Caribbean Sea is what borders just north of South America and south of North America, and it's all the islands that compose, you know, the Bahamas, the Barbados, Cuba, Grenada, Haiti, Jamaica, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, of course, Trinidad. But there are also countries in South America, such as Guyana and Suriname, which are technically part of South America, but they're also considered part of the Caribbean, and due to this history of indentureship. So when we talk about Hinduism in the Caribbean, we're actually primarily speaking about Hinduism in a few countries, because that's where the majority of the Hindus settled. So the first country was Guyana. That was in 1838, was when the first indentured laborers came. And then from there, they went to Trinidad and Jamaica in 1845, and then smaller pockets went to some of the other islands like Saint Kitts and Saint Lucia. But it is Suriname, Trinidad, Guyana by far that has the largest percentage of Hindus. So by a sort of country by country basis, right now, roughly there was a 2011 census for the island of Trinidad, and they say it's about 18% of the population is Hindu. So clearly not a majority, but still much more than I would say Hindus either in the U.S. or Canada. Guyana, on the other hand, is much larger. They're at about 31% Hindus, and that was as of 2020. When we talk about the political nature, so Hindus did establish parties, and this was in the the 1950s and the 1960s in Trinidad. But now, as time has gone on, is that they've tried to move away from strictly talking about like a party for Indians and trying to be a little bit more broad based. But the reality is that people still vote how they vote.
I mean, the numbers that you've said are quite staggering. I wasn't aware, that 30% of Suriname, you said, right? Suriname
Uh,
is Hindu.
yes. So
That's a pretty large number. I mean,
oh
I'm
yes.
quite. It's quite staggering. I didn't know this. It's
There
quite
was,
a big
was,
number.
uh, there was a news item on social media that the president of Suriname, maybe a couple of years ago,
Yep.
took his oath on the Bhagavad Gita and that he's a practicing Hindu. And that's
Yes.
when I came to know that 30% of Suriname is of Hindu heritage.
Yeah. So I mean that's just how the society is so yeah. So the big three are Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. So anywhere between 20 to 30% of the population is Hindu. Yes, absolutely.
Given these numbers, I mean, I'm surprised we don't have much stronger ties between India and these countries. I mean, we don't hear so much of any of these countries in India. What do you put that to?
That this is one of my major pain points is that I totally agree is that and I mean I don't blame India as well because not everyone was aware of what ended up happening because my ancestors weren't in some urban center. They were taken from remote villages either in UP, Bihar, or if even down south. They were so when you talk about India as a country of over a billion people, like 200,000, 300,000, or by most estimates, they said about 500,000 Indians left. Anywhere between 500,000 to 800,000 Indians left, the majority being Hindu. It's quite literally a drop in the bucket. So I do understand from that point is that that's why a lot of India is not aware because it was such a small amount. That being said, I do feel that in modern times that through social media, number one, this is starting to change. And even if you want to look at just more pop culture stuff, like cricket is probably one of the major things that a lot of Indians honing in on because they watch India versus the West Indies, and then they start realizing is that how come a lot of the players on the West Indies have Indian last names. And if you just go on either X or Facebook or Instagram, is that's where a lot of the questions start coming up. I do feel though is that India, you know, should probably pay a little bit more attention to the diaspora or the diaspora more because of the impact that we have had here on the West. 19 47 was a big time for the country with partition and everything else. And I think most Indians themselves don't know their own history. So, but I mean, through podcasts like this, through my YouTube channel, and just trying to speak, this tide is starting to change. I would say growing up here in Toronto has opened up a lot of the eyes of Hindus worldwide, because Toronto in particular is very multicultural, meaning that people from all over the world. We have gotten to know Hindus from all over the world, whether it be India or Mauritius or Fiji, or us from the Caribbean. And it's not something that I think a lot of Hindus are exposed to, but we are lucky here in Toronto that there is much more exposure.
Shawn, actually, two things stand out to me from what you've said. First is the sense of community and of a shared struggle cementing the Hindu identity. The second is, of course, about education, having Hindu schools, which are also top academic institutions. Given the difference between the environment in India and how it is in the Caribbean, at least how it used to be, and I hope it still is for Hindus, do you see any difference between Hindus raised in the Caribbean and the Hindus coming in to North America, to Toronto, Canada today, after being raised in India?
That is an excellent question, because that is exactly where we are right now. I would say, to answer your question, yes, I think there is a difference between Hindus raised in the Caribbean versus those coming raised in India. And I think the reason for that is due, as you said, and as I had said earlier, is that this shared struggle to survive cemented this idea of forming a community. And it's something that when you are born and raised in India, it's something that you sort of take for granted. So if you are from India, and you're listening to this and you're still there right now, your Hindu festivals that happen, every so often, it's something that you just kind of take for granted, is that there is going to be a temple just down the street, and they will be celebrating Navratri or Shivratri or any one of those things. But when you come to the Caribbean, and now myself growing up here in Canada, is that you have to work to build a temple. You have to work to actually do these things yourself, because there isn't like a local pundit that is just doing this because that's what he's been doing from his ancestry. So there's a lot of groundwork that had to be laid and a community formed in order for these things to be maintained. And when I do meet Hindus from India, and I would say that it's the people from my parents' generation, meaning that they were, they came here in the 80s and the 90s, is that there were some of them that realized this. But then there was a lot of them that said, you know what, I don't need to be part of a larger community, because I can simply pray in my home, or I could do everything in my home. And that's where I think things were lost, is that yes, I am not disagreeing that everyone can have their home puja altar, but this sense of identity is the community that's formed. And I think that's where Hindus in the Caribbean, they had years of this being cemented into their identities, so that when they came here in North America, it was just more of the same that they had to do. They had to work to establish the Mandir environment, and then they were already congregating at least once a week, so that just continued here. Whereas the Hindus from India, when they come here, this sense of going to the mandir once a week is lost on them, because they're like, I don't need to go once a week. I could simply go any day that I have time and go for darshan, which is, yes, that's true. But that group identity gets lost. And one of the things that I tell many of the parents that I'm friends with now, that I work with, is that when you walk out of your doors of your home, you're not walking into a Hindu environment. You're walking into what is essentially a Western environment. So how is it that you are going to maintain that Hindu identity the minute you walk out of this home? Because you're going to the grocery store and it's not a Hindu place. You're going to your workplace, it's not a Hindu place. Is that, where is it that you maintain it? And this is where I say is that the community you form, and that community that you form is usually centered around a Mandir environment. I am happy to say is that a lot of the newly arrived immigrants that are now coming, they are realizing this quite early on, is that, in order to create a sense of a Hindu identity, you need to be part of a community. But that is not something that's a passive experience. It is something that mentally, like, you have to make it an active environment. So that is where I think there are differences, but I think that both of these groups are now starting to realize is that moving forward, as we want to establish roots here in Canada, is that sense of community needs to be there.
This sort of goes to say, how a mandir is seen as a different entity when you're outside India. Uh, it is a community center, like you mentioned, and for the person coming from India, the mandir is the home of the deity. So, and it's just some place where you go visit and come back. That's how that's how Hindus in India have been sort of conditioned, that the mandir is the home of the deity. So, I'm assuming that from what you said, the newly arrived community is also finding that uh, making the mandir a community center is useful to continue transmission. So, how do you sort of get Hindu kids to want to go to the mandir every week? I'm assuming now it's a community thing, and it sort of mimics the church going, style of the Western nations. And so you're congregating once a week. So, what makes Hindu kids want to go to the mandir? Do they want to go in the first place?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I do agree is that the Hindu temples here in North America, which and here in the Greater Toronto area, certainly do mimic this Western style of a Christian church, which I think many Hindus in India might push back against, saying that, oh no, we don't need to do that because a Hindu temple, as you rightfully said, is the home of the deity. And I'm not disagreeing with that, is that is true. The mandirs are established to be a home for the deity. At the same time, though, is that here in the West, is that you can certainly have all that. You do all your pujas and you do all your abhishekams and you do all of that. But the mandir is now also a community hub. And the question that you asked is that how do you get kids to come? And I think this is the fundamental question that I have been living with my entire life. And I'll just give you a little bit of history on this. My father passed away last year, so it's been about a year since he passed away, and quite shortly after he passed away, there was a tweet that I had seen, or something on X, where someone had posted a link to the history of some of the temples here in the Greater Toronto area. And it was a paper written by a sociologist in the early 90s who had interviewed a lot of the management of some of the temples. And I just started reading it because I was interested in what was being said, because I was a young kid at the time. But in reading it, I saw that they had interviewed my father, who was the founding president of one of the local mandirs here. And the one thing that he had said is that back in the 90s, one of the questions that my father, and what he had said in this paper, is that how is it that we're going to pass on the traditions to the next generation. And that is exactly where I find myself now, 35 years later, is that how are we passing the tradition on? And one of the mistakes that I had seen growing up is this sort of top-down approach where you're trying to force kids to come into the temple, and you make sure that they do all of these things. And the one area is that you simply just, as a parent, you have to be that role model. You need to be the example that you want your kids to become. So that means is that if if you are not making attending any type of Mandir function something regular in your life, don't expect your kids to do it once they're 16, 17, 18, 19. So from a very young age, I remember my mother and my father bringing us to the Mandir, whether it be snow, rain, or anything, is that this is what we did. We just went for every festival, for every function. We just went. So by constantly going and making, attending these functions, the one of the primary things that you do in your life, that was the first thing. As I got older, and what I realized is that there are more things that needed to be done. And I think making Mandir and the community side of things fun and interactive, and having youth groups with social events and social gatherings and all of these things, this is how you keep youth engaged in their Hindu identity, is that you need to make friends that are Hindu. It's simple as that. If you make friends outside that are outside, then you are going to be looking for that social interaction outside of the Mandir environment. But you make friends that are Hindu, that are doing the same things as you are 95% of the way there of maintaining that Hindu identity. Now, is this going to apply for everyone? No, but I think the large majority of the Hindu population is will follow this. And I can look back at my own life and I could see everyone that I have grown up with, and this holds true for all of them. The issue now, though, as I see it in 2024, is that many of us have now grown up here in the greater Toronto area. We now need to start bringing back what is it that we value as a Hindu, and we need to find value in the Hindu practices. So what the active work that I'm doing right now is to educate now the younger kids growing up, because that's something that I actually didn't have, is that we attended because my parents went and we just followed by example. So that still has to happen, but let's add one thing more. Let's go to the temple, let's get the kids into one sort of group class, and let's see what is it that they have questions on, because many kids have many questions on what it means to be a Hindu. Why is it that we do this? Why is it that we do that? And these are some of the things that we're hoping to address right now in 2024.
What is the role played by music and dance in the transmission of culture? Because personally, I strongly believe that music and dance makes you connect emotionally with the divine. Music and dance, as in kirtans, bhajans, or classical music and dance, it's a very integral experience of being Hindu. That's the way I look at it. And I'd like your thoughts on this, Shawn.
Yeah, music and dance for us in the Caribbean has been our, what I would say, the soft entry into Hinduism. You speak to anyone that is of Guyanese origin or whose parents are from Trinidad or Suriname, music is number one, the one thing that hooks you in. So within my own family, I myself play dolak. I play and I teach tabla. My sister, who is younger than me, she's a vocalist. She learned here and she sings. My brother, who is older, he sings. He learned to play sitar as well. Any Caribbean family who is Hindu, I guarantee you, there's probably someone within that family that does something musical or something dance. That is the easiest way to transmit this Hindu culture to the next generation through the cultural arts, because number one, it's fun, it's engaging, and it allows you to enter in, and then at your own pace, that's how you start to like learn more and more, and you start to branch out. That is how I got involved. That is how I know many of our members, or members of the community who are from the Caribbean. That is how they maintain their Hindu identity, is through bhajans, through singing, kirtan. In my own family right now, my own boys, we got into the habit from when they were babies, is that we would sing and play the Hanuman Chalisa every single morning. You ask them now to sing it and they can. So my 6-year-old knows it and my 3-year-old knows it as well. And that didn't involve any teaching. It just involved singing of the Hanuman Chalisa daily in our home. And we just play it. Everyone might have like a Google Home device or an Amazon Alexa or anything like that. You just play it on the speakers every single morning. And right now, like the kids would be running around playing and they're just screaming it out loud. They're singing it. So I think music, dance is the easiest way to get anyone involved. Easiest way to get anyone involved. And it gives the kids something to work towards. It gives them something where they can now show off their skills. They can see internally, how good can I become at this? And it's one of the ways that it's fun, and it's a very simple way to maintain the tradition. And it's what has worked for us from the Caribbean.
So, Shawn, what's your advice for the parents listening to this podcast? I know we've talked a lot about it, but is there something you'd like to say in addition to what you've said? And also the most important thing for parents to do today to ensure that their kids stay Hindu?
Most important thing, don't put academic education ahead of a spiritual upbringing. That is the biggest problem that I saw of kids of my generation. I remember growing up, and my father would ask, like, the parents who are of his age, why aren't you bringing, your son or daughter to the temple? Why aren't you bringing them to participate or do this? And the number one thing you would hear is that, oh, my kids have studies. They have studies. They're involved in this, so they can't come to this. And if that is the excuse that you're making from a very young age, by the time you're 20 and 30, you will not have any sense of what your Hindu identity is. Mm-hmm. I say focus on academics, but not at the expense of your spirituality, because at the end of the day, you are trying to teach your kids how to connect to that divine being, that source that makes us who we are, that gives us the energy, that provides everything to us. Both have to go hand in hand. Second thing, as parents, live the example that you want your kids to do. So if you want your kids to do a daily puja or sadhana, it could be as simple as you want. Are you doing it yourself? Because if you're not doing it, don't expect your kids to do it. Second thing is, don't complain if they're not following the traditions of your ancestors, because if they are complaining about doing it, then you haven't done your work as a parent. It's not too late to reverse any of these things, depending on how old your kids are. It just requires more work. It's much easier from a younger age, and I can say that because now I'm a father of 2 boys. My oldest just turned 6, and my youngest just turned 3. And I will give you a question that my 3-year-old just asked us on Janmashtami night. So we had a busy weekend because every one of us in our family, we have our birthdays in August. So we had a birthday satsang within our own home, where we invited our friends and family, and it was a busy weekend. And then the day after, we were going to the Mandir for Janmashtami, and it's late at night, as your audience is well aware, as Janmashtami is midnight. So we gave the kids a nap, and then we were leaving home around 9:30 at night to go to the Mandir. And my 3-year-old, he turns to my wife and he asks, is Krishna real? Is Krishna in the murtis? Like, is he in the temple or is he outside of the temple? A 3-year-old is asking us this question. So now, how is it that he even has this awareness around to even ask something as simple and complicated as this? And I wasn't aware that he had asked this, but it was my wife that heard it, and she had to kind of stop and like think about how to answer this. And and he is only able to answer this because of the lifestyle that we choose to live. Is that so what did we tell him? We said, yes, Krishna is in the murtis of the temple. Krishna is also inside you. Krishna is also outside as a real energy, as a real life force. But something like that is only possible if you yourself are living that lifestyle. And it kind of goes back to the name of my YouTube channel, Hindu Lifestyle, is that this is what it's all about, is things like that, simple things like that.
So this makes it rather profound, because today, you know, these debates around Krishna and all have uh, sort of become about chronology, dates. It's not about the persona. It's not about the tattva that Krishna brings.
Yes.
It's not any of that. It's You're trying to make it as scientific as possible, as if that's going to get you a seat at the table, just because you make it scientific. But that's where we are. And this whole thing about being rational is actually desacralizing the concept of our deities.
Actually, yeah, you raise a very interesting point, because I think one of the major pushes within the last 10 years was to try to make this, and I see it on social media all the time right now, is that Hinduism is such a scientific religion. It's such a scientific this, it's such a scientific that, and we do X, Y, and Z because of this, and it affects the neurons, and it does this and it does that. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, do you think kids today are going to be Hindu because you're telling them that it's scientific? Everything that we do is based on emotions. And we need to tap into sort of the deeper reasons why we're, quote unquote, spiritual. And you're very right, is that there was a push, and there still is a push right now to like talk about the history of Krishna as a figure in history that had done this at these dates, and the archaeology and all of this. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, that's great, but that is not going to convince someone who is 16 in 2024 to say, well, this is the reason why I'm going to the temple, because Krishna was a real person, and all of this. The essence of our deities, the essence of Krishna, the essence of what does it means to be Hindu is much deeper than that.
I wanted to ask, I don't know if you've been to India, and have you seen Hinduism at work in India? And now, of course, you have an experience of seeing Hinduism in the West. So where do you see Hindus and Hinduism, say, 25 years, both in India and abroad? That is, if you have exposure to the Indian version of Hinduism.
So no, I haven't been to India yet. That is a question that many people ask me. I do plan. I had set out the intention, saying that within the next 5 years, I would make plans to go and visit as many places as I can, once my kids are just a little bit older, so that they would be able to remember it. My exposure to Hinduism in India is broadly from all of the interactions that I've had on social media, in meeting Indians who came from India that have settled here, and listening to their stories. And I would broadly say that India right now is largely a Western country, by most standards. Yes, you have your pockets that are rural and that are still adhering to the traditions. But if you look at urban India, that many of today's youth are a part of, I would say that it's largely a Western country. So the issues affecting Hindus in India are going to be the same of those here in the West that are affecting us because it is a Western country. I think where there needs to be more of a push in the next 25 years is towards this idea of, and I have mentioned this to a few others, of this global Hindu, like a global Hindu identity where Hinduism is not something that is just particular to the country that you are born in or to the family that you are born into. Is that because we have always sort of maintained this, if you listen to anyone that speaks about the Shastras or the Puranas or anything, is that to be a Hindu, yes, being born into it is your karma, which is great, but the global Hindu identity is now one where we recognize Bharat as that sacred geography, that sacred space, where there are going to be those sacred locations where you go and you do your sadhana and you do your puja. But worldwide now is that Hinduism can be maintained outside of India. And I think that's where the push is going to be, is that how do we define Hinduism from a more global perspective, and and how is it that this identity persists moving forward? If I have to make a bold statement, I would say that Hindus from the Caribbean, while we may have lost the language, while we may not know all the complex pujas and the rituals that have been passed on, we were able to maintain the Hindu identity by doing very simple things, very simple things. And I think it's getting back to those basics of your everyday Hindu life. And that is what's going to persist and make Hinduism persist in the next 25 years. So for anyone in India listening to this, get back to the roots. That doesn't mean you need to be an expert on Hinduism, but daily things done in your life is very important. Very, very important, because that is what maintained the tradition for my father, for my grandfather, for my great great grandfather. And that is what I'm doing here today, like in 2024 in Canada, in Toronto, is daily things in your home. Second thing, be part of a larger community. You need to have this group identity, because a group identity further cements your own sense of who you are, of what you're a part of. I'm happy to say that my 6-year-old, he just turned 6, and I would say he has embraced Hinduism more so than I had, that I did growing up. Whereas he is not afraid to kind of just play his bhajans in the car as we're rolling up into school. Whereas I know for myself is that I still had this sense of, oh no, like this kind of shyness about it. Whereas he's like, no, this is what I want to play, because that's what we do. So I think for everyone listening to this, don't make it harder than it needs to be. It is simple. It's just that you yourself have to make that change in your life, and then by example, your kids will follow.
Thank you so much, Shawn. It's been an invaluable learning experience for us. And there are so many pointers here in what you said for Hindus worldwide, and especially many lessons for Hindus in India, because I think the final battlefield is really going to be India. If we lose India, there's not, you really don't have the power of the kshetrams and so many things that India is home for Hindus worldwide, and that should not change. And what you mentioned about India becoming a Western country is so true today. Urban India, the part where you mentioned when you walk out of your home abroad, you must remember that you're walking out into an environment that is not Hindu, holds good, unfortunately, for the current situation in India. People, when we walk out of our houses in India, the atmosphere is slowly changing. And for a child, a 10-year-old today growing up in urban India, the atmosphere in the school and when he or she walks out of the home is not Hindu at all. So this is something we need to work towards to keep it simple, like you said. it's also worth mentioning here that one of the goals for us at Hindu Parenting is to work towards a common unified Hindu identity worldwide, because parenting is the glue that binds us all together with similar concerns, no matter where we are raising our children today.
As Rekha said, I think there are lots and lots of lessons for Indian Hindus, whose very big challenge would be to cement that group identity. I think that's where the crux of the problem is. We are still very individualistic, and the congregating nature of Hindus abroad is probably one way which we can adopt to be Hindus 25 years down the road. So thank you, Shawn. Thank you very much for coming on the show. And we've both enjoyed talking to you. And we hope that there are many, many lessons that our listeners, both in India and in the diaspora, can take from this podcast. To all our listeners, we are on Substack as a platform, and our URL is hinduparenting.substack.com. So please do subscribe to us if you find our content interesting. We are on all social media channels. We go by the handle Hindu Parenting on all of them. We are there on X, we are there on Facebook, we are also there on Instagram and YouTube. These podcasts can also be heard on any of the podcast platforms like Spotify or Google Podcasts or Apple Podcasts. So you can catch us wherever you feel comfortable. Thank you for listening in.